Picture this. It's 2008. The financial world is collapsing, and the US government steps in, acting like they've just invented this brilliant, totally unprecedented toolkit to save the economy. Well, spoiler alert, that was a total lie. They didn't invent anything. They were just copying homework. And not even the good kind. They were literally tracing over Japan's disastrous, completely failed bailout playbook from the 1990s.
We've all been sold a massive illusion, haven't we? We're constantly told that modern government rescues are swift, they're calculated, and they're effective. Today, in this explainer, we are tearing that facade right down because the hard data, it shows something completely different. It shows that so-called cures for financial crises often just breed new terrifying diseases. Okay, let's dive right into this. To really understand what happened to us in 2008, we have to rewind to Japan. Now, this wasn't just a quick little market dip. No, this was a grueling, decade-long nightmare. It started quietly enough in 1991 with housing loan collapses. But by 1997, massive system-critical banks were defaulting. And by 2002, the entire economy was heavily infected by what economists call zombie corporations. November 1997 was the absolute breaking point. Look at that massive spike right there. That is the Japan premium. Basically, global markets suddenly forced Japanese banks to pay a brutal, punishing penalty just to borrow money. Two major banks completely collapsed in that exact same month. The interbank market just instantly froze solid. Literally overnight panic. So, how did the government respond to this chaos? With absolute, utter denial. I mean, get this. In early 1999, Japan's Vice Minister of Finance literally stood up and told the world the banking crisis would be over in 2 weeks. 2 weeks! Meanwhile, international watchdogs and the U.S. Treasury were screaming at the top of their lungs, hey, Japanese banks are massively undercapitalized. The government was selling a total fantasy to the public, but the math told the brutal truth. Section 1. The fake accounting game and how they hid massive losses. To keep these essentially dead banks breathing, the government allowed them to use a highly dangerous accounting trick called deferred tax assets. Now, let's strip away the boring academic jargon. What does that actually mean? It means banks were counting hypothetical, entirely imaginary future tax breaks as cold, hard cash today. They pretended they were wealthy based on taxes they hoped to save, if they magically ever became profitable again. It was pure fiction. Now, what's really interesting about this is the sheer scale of the deception. In March 2002, official government-approved numbers claimed Japanese banks had 30.2 trillion yen in core capital. Looks great, right? But wait, strip away those imaginary tax assets, adjust for the hidden losses, and the modified true capital was barely 12.8 trillion yen. These banks were secretly totally broke. Their safety buffer was completely 100% gone. When you track the whole system from 97 through 2003, the cover-up just becomes absolutely undeniable. Just look at the massive chunk taken up by deferred tax assets every single year. The government just closed their eyes and ignored this entirely. By relying on these completely questionable tax credits, they masked a gigantic systemic capital deficit. And honestly, it gets even worse. 6.8 trillion yen. Just let that number sink in for a second. That is the amount of under-reserving by March 2002. What this really tells us is that banks were wildly, delusionally optimistic. They simply flat out refused to set aside the cash they needed to cover loans they already knew were going to fail. The entire system was teetering on a totally fake foundation. Moving on to Section 2, the rise of zombie firms and how they infected the economy. By tracking the lending data over time, researchers found this terrifying shift. The actual root of the economic cancer migrated. In the early 90s, bad loans were heavily tied to the crashed real estate market. Makes sense, right? But by the early 2000s, the data completely flips. A brand new disease was spreading, and it was spreading fast. So the crucial point is this twist in the data. Before the year 2000, non-performing loans were all about busted real estate developers. But after 2001, boom, the bad debt was suddenly being driven by small and medium enterprises. The bank's toxic assets had physically jumped over to a completely different sector of the economy. But why? Well, here is the exact devastating recipe for how you create a zombie outbreak. Step 1. To get their hands on government bailout money, banks were forced to increase their lending to small and medium businesses. So, what did the banks actually do? They just threw money at dying, completely unprofitable companies just to hit their government quotas. These bankrupt zombies were essentially put on artificial life support. And here is the tragic irony of it all. Healthy, innovative businesses, the ones that actually needed the capital to grow, were entirely starved out. The government's conditional bailouts literally destroyed the nation's productivity. It's crazy.
Which brings us to Section 3, the iron-fisted purge, or stopping the fake accounting.
Enter Heizo Takanaka. He becomes the new minister of the Financial Services Agency in September 2002, and he immediately brings the hammer down with the Takanaka plan. No more illusions. Step 1, rigorous, unapologetic evaluations of bank assets. No more hiding. Step 2, forcing real capital increases. If your capital fell below the standard because your fake deferred taxes were rejected, the government stepped in. Step 3, strengthening governance and ruthlessly punishing failures. Guys, this is what actual tough regulation looks like. And this brilliantly illustrates what actually happens when the government finally stops playing nice. Take the case of UFJ Holdings. They fail to meet their profit targets under these new rules. And the consequences, absolute shockwaves. CEOs were forced to resign immediately. New management had their salaries suspended. Dividends, completely shut down. Employee bonuses were slashed by 80%. True, painful accountability was finally actually enforced. And guess what? It worked. Starting in 2003, you see this dramatic plunge in non-performing loans. By strictly enforcing the rules and forcing actual painful corporate reorganization, the government finally stopped the creation of new bad loans. They physically purged the old toxic debt right out of the system. But doing this took incredible force. 6.2 trillion yen. That is the massive amount of debt restructured by the government's Resolution and Collection Corporation for just 577 dying borrowers. They didn't just buy up the bad loans and wait around. No, these aggressive government asset management companies had to physically get their hands dirty. They reorganized the debt and actively restructured the companies to finally kill off the zombie problem for good. Finally, Section 4, the real historical lessons and the parallels to the US. Let's move to this and see how it builds, because the parallels here are frankly terrifying. Just like Japan in the 90s, the US in 2008 initially panicked. They stretched their existing tools way too thin instead of taking bold, decisive action early on. Both nations flip-flopped, shifting wildly from buying up toxic assets to just injecting capital straight into weak, failing banks. And crucially, both nations spent an enormous amount of time propping up the illusion of bank health before they finally forced real, rigorous stress tests. So, we have to ask ourselves, have our governments actually learned how to fix a financial crisis? Or are they just finding new, more sophisticated ways to fund zombies while hiding the real cost from you and me? The data from Japan tells us one brutal, unavoidable truth. Without absolute transparency and true accountability, the cure is always, always worse than the disease.